So I'm going to finish up with this lecture the fluid and electrolyte chapter. And I wanted to come back to heat index because there's a good chance that at some time in your life, either you'll be exercising in the heat or you'll be supervising other people exercising in the heat. And maybe those people will be kids. And I wanted you to be aware of the relationship, and I wanted to talk further about the relationship between ambient temperature and humidity. And so heat index is how warm it feels, and how warm it feels is related to the ambient temperature and the humidity. And the more humid it is, the more water vapor is dissolved in the air. And the more water vapor that's dissolved in the air, the less effective your body is at evaporative cooling, because that means less of your sweat is able to dissolve into the environment, and that evaporation of sweat from your skin is associated with your body's ability to cool. And so what you'll notice, there's this table, there's a white region, a blue region, and a progressively darker blue region, and you can see here what those regions mean. And so you can see that the white region is caution and the blue region is extreme caution, then it progresses from there. And so what this means is that when you're in extreme caution or caution, it means that you should be cautious in how long you are outside, and specifically outside exercising, and specifically if you're exercising very vigorously, because our body's only 25% efficient. That means 75% of your energy that you consume while you're exercising is lost as heat. And if you're in exercising in extreme caution or more dangerous conditions, it means that you should essentially take frequent breaks. You should be able to find a place where you can go and cool off, and you can get out of the sun, that you have cool beverages to drink, that you're monitoring yourself or the people that you are supervising for symptoms of heat stroke. And so that's disorientation, that's profuse sweating, it's rapid pulse, it's a very flushed appearance, it's weakness. And we talked about the relationship between dehydration and heat stroke. And so if you're dehydrated, then your body is trying to use your plasma volume is trying to be used to provide oxygen and nutrients for your muscles, but it's also being diverted to your skin to try to promote evaporative cooling. And so if you are dehydrated or hypohydrated, your body water's low, then you may not be able to sufficiently cool your body, and your chance of heat stroke is a lot higher. So hypohydration is a risk factor for heat stroke. But research, and I think this research was in soldiers in Iraq potentially, but I can look it up if you'd like. But this research showed that people with heat stroke, of those people, only about 25% were hypohydrated. So what that means is you can be hypohydrated, and that's a risk factor for heat stroke, but you can also develop heat stroke and not be hypohydrated. And so just kind of want to make you a little bit aware of the relationship. So you can develop heat stroke and heat illness without being hypohydrated. And so then we talked about body water gains, and essentially your body gains water from the food you take in, the beverages you consume, and also a little bit from aerobic metabolism. And so it's not just what you drink, but it's also the types of food that you eat. And obviously, some foods are more water containing than others. You could think about, for example, a watermelon versus something that's very dry. An oat bran pretzel. That's a great example. And so you can look at this slide and think about hypohydration, euhydration, and then hyperhydration, and those definitions. And sodium is the major extracellular ion, and so it's the major ion or the major electrolyte that's lost in sweat. And processed food has a significant amount of sodium as sodium chloride, because sodium chloride is a very good food preservative, and so high salt means that a high salt content in a food means that the food can have a longer shelf life. And so sodium chloride contains sodium, and about 40% of sodium chloride, or table salt, is sodium. So for each gram of sodium chloride, about 400 milligrams, or for each gram of sodium chloride, about 400 milligrams are sodium. And sodium excretion is regulated by the kidneys, and typical American intake far exceeds our daily needs. And so for most Americans, it's recommended that they have a low sodium intake, especially as people get older. Their ability to regulate their sodium content in their blood is compromised because their kidney function is usually compromised. And so for most Americans, it's recommended that they follow a low salt diet, which is 1,300 milligrams per day. For the average American not prone to hypertension, the recommendation, the dietary reference intake, is about 2.5 grams or 2,500 milligrams. And so, and actually I take that back, because right here on the slide it says the upper intake level for sodium is 2,300 milligrams, so 2.3 grams. But for athletes, it's not recommended that they follow a low salt diet, because low salt means that, or may cause them to have low plasma sodium concentrations, because you lose sodium in your sweat. You want to have plenty of sodium in your blood, not excessive, but plenty of sodium to be able to lose some in sweat. So athletes should not follow, generally, unless they have hypertension and are followed with their doctor and talk to a dietitian, should not follow a low salt diet. The other electrolyte that we're going to talk about, or that we have talked about to some extent, is potassium. And potassium is the major intracellular ion. And potassium is found in food, beverages, in salt substitutes. It's found as potassium chloride. It's highest in unprocessed food. It's found in lots of fruits and vegetables. And the recommended intake for potassium is 4.7 grams or 4,700 milligrams. But the average daily intakes in the United States fall far below the dietary recommended or reference intake for potassium. And that low intake, it reflects the lack of fruits and vegetables. And so you don't want to take a potassium supplement, because your body tightly regulates potassium levels in your blood. If your potassium levels become too high, your body releases aldosterone, your adrenal cortex, and your adrenal cortex causes potassium to be secreted into the urine. And so in high potassium, something called hyperkalemia results in, it can result in cardiac arrhythmias. It can also result in your muscles contracting and becoming very tonic, so that it's very uncomfortable. But primarily it's dangerous, because you could experience a cardiac arrhythmia. So getting potassium from fruits and vegetables is the best way to maintain your potassium levels. And generally, when you're looking at, or you're considering consuming post-exercise beverages, or even beverages while you're exercising, you want to be aware, because some of them do contain potassium, and you just want to make sure that their potassium levels are very, very low if they do contain potassium, because you want to avoid hyperkalemia. Let's see how self-prescribed potassium supplements can result in hyperkalemia. We already talked about that. Hypokalemia, that can also result in cardiac arrhythmias. Can be caused by diuretics. So some diuretics that are given to people with hypertension to lower their blood pressure cause potassium to be secreted in the urine, and then that causes water loss into the urine. Then they pee more frequently, and so people can become hypokalemic because they are taking diuretics that are not potassium sparing diuretics. Now they have those, so because people are getting hypokalemia. And also someone who vomits quite frequently, they can also develop hypokalemia. So sometimes people with bulimia, or they will eat and then they will vomit up what they just ate. They will cause themselves to vomit. They can develop hypokalemia, and that is low blood potassium, and that's also a dangerous, really dangerous condition because of the role that potassium plays in generating nerve depolarization and the cardiac rhythm. So potassium excretion is precisely regulated by the kidneys, and we talked about that related to aldosterone. And so when your body releases aldosterone, it causes potassium secretion into the urine and sodium reabsorption into the blood. And so let's see. So exercise challenges fluid homeostasis because we lose fluid in sweat, or we use plasma in sweat, and that's because the increase in body temperature and then evaporation of sweat is a primary mechanism to control body temperature. And the decrease in plasma volume occurs within minutes of beginning exercise, and a loss. So I'm just going to tell you, I'm going to deviate from what the textbook says because of the more recent research, and your textbook hasn't quite caught up. So here it says a loss of 5% is not likely to impair performance, but cardiovascular function and exercise performance are compromised with a loss of 10 to 20% of plasma volume. And so this actually, the point at which cardiovascular function and exercise performance are compromised it depends on the individual. It depends on the exercise that they're doing, and often water losses during exercise are discussed in terms of body weight changes. And so high level performance athletes, like people that run the Boston Marathon, ultra endurance athletes, can lose over 10% of their body weight when they're in extreme endurance events, but their performance isn't compromised. And so we'll talk more about that as we go through these slides. So it doesn't mean that losing body water while you're exercising is not something that you shouldn't try to avoid, but it's just not as, you shouldn't be as hypervigilant about it as, I guess, the Gatorade companies and the sport beverage companies hope that you will be in order to consume their beverages. And so this is rectal temperature. This is a study where they measured rectal temperature, and these people are exercising. So what you'll notice is they're exercising it's not until they've been exercising for well over an hour that their body temperature starts to rise, even if they don't replace their fluids at all. And so So here's no fluid replacement, and here's fluid replacement. And so if you consume fluids, your body temperature, rectal temperature, is indicative of your core temperature, doesn't rise as much. And so whether this compromises performance or not is debatable and often depends on the athlete. And so some of the factors that affect sweat loss, we've talked about these, like solar radiation, the sun, wind velocity. So if there's more wind, then that's going to allow for convective air currents to pull the warm air away from your skin. And so then your skin cools more easily. And then relative humidity, because that affects evaporative heat loss. And so last semester there was someone who worked at 24, and they said, we have this person and she exercises on I think it was stair climber, and she sweats a lot, and there's lots of sweat and it pools, and so what can we do to reduce the amount of sweat that ends up on the machine after she's done working out? And I said, well, put a fan, right? Because if you put a fan, then that's going to move the warm air away from her skin, and so then it would help her to cool better, and so then she wouldn't produce as much sweat. And so you can think about things like that. The other things that affect heat strain, and so these would be things that you would think about if the heat index is very high, especially if the heat index is very high. And so exercise intensity, we talked about that, 75% is lost as heat. So that's going to increase body temperature, clothing, and so either it allows evaporative cooling or it insulates the body and doesn't allow that evaporative cooling. Larger body size, you expend more energy, so that means you're going to produce more heat when you're exercising. Body fat levels, body fat is insulating, and so people that are larger with larger fat mass tend to be more insulated, so they could be more sensitive to heat strain. Also, the level of physical conditioning. So if people are not very physically fit, then they could be more sensitive to heat strain. But people that are physically fit, especially aerobic fitness, they tend to have a higher plasma volume, and so they are able to lose more sweat without it compromising cardiovascular function. And then acclimating to a warm environment, and so that takes a couple weeks, about 14 days, and that results in an increased plasma volume, and it also results in your sweating at a lower core temperature, so you start sweating earlier in the exercise. And so this is just looking at, so this is exercise intensity, and this is sweat rate, and so you can see in a cool, dry environment how the sweat rates differ versus in a hot, humid environment. And so if you're training for a particular event, or if you're training in a you usually train in a cool, dry environment, and you're training in a hot, humid environment, you need to be aware that that's going to change your body's production of sweat. So you have to think about that when you're thinking about fluid and electrolyte replacement. And so this just shows you, so under normal conditions, a hot condition, and this is a hot condition with strenuous, when someone's doing strenuous exercise. And so you can see how when in a hot environment, and especially in a hot environment when you're exercising, your thirst receptors are stimulated to cause you to drink more. So you're going to if you listen to your thirst sensation, you will drink more. And so generally, it doesn't affect your food intake or the water that you get from food, but it definitely affects your propensity to drink and your fluid output. So you can see how different it is. And we said that urine was the primary mechanism that our body uses to regulate fluid volume, and you can see how in a sort of normal environment, here's a hot environment. And so in a hot environment, how you're losing so much more water and sweat as compared to a normal environment, and how because you're losing so much water as sweat, your urine volume goes down and your fluid intake goes up. And so this is your body's naturally adapted for those two mechanisms to kick in. And so then when you're doing strenuous work, how your sweating increases even more, how your urine volume goes down even more, and your propensity to drink increases. And so your body, if you listen to your body, will stimulate you to drink, and it will also reduce your urine volume to try to reduce fluid losses and keep you from perishing, essentially. And so sweat loss can vary significantly, and that we just saw that compared to in different environments. We saw it compared to when you're strenuously exercising versus not. And so usually use very little when you're not exercising in a temperate environment. You can lose up to 2.5 liters per hour in prolonged exercise in the heat. And in cold environments, you also lose water as you lose it as sweat, but you also lose it when you exhale. And so if you're losing as much as 3 liters per hour from sweat, you can't replenish that much water, and because the gastric emptying is about 1 liter per hour. And so even if you consumed 3 liters, your gastric emptying is only going to release 1 liter into your intestine and make that available for reabsorption. And so oftentimes when you're exercising, you will become voluntarily dehydrate or become a little hypohydrated, because the rate of gastric emptying and fluid absorption is limited. And so, and especially if you're doing intense exercise, that impedes gastric emptying even more. So so it's less likely that, or it draws blood away from your gastrointestinal tract, so you don't digest food as well as if you weren't intensely exercising. And so body water weight losses of from 2 to actually 10% are pretty normal in athletes, especially athletes exercising in the heat. And so the key to athletes exercising in the heat really should be that they should be training in the heat so that they're acclimated to the heat conditions. And also, not that they should drink before they're thirsty, but that they should drink when they're thirsty. And so this is something very, very different than what's been recommended in the past, specifically by the American College of Sports Medicine, the National Strength and Conditioning Association, and the National Athletic Training Association. They used to say, drink before you're thirsty. Now the recommendation is don't drink until you're thirsty. Or so don't try to prevent dehydration. And so that's because more and more people are they're over drinking, and they're developing low sodium content in their plasma, and it's killing them. And so we'll come back to that. So your body is designed to prevent excessive fluid losses because it's not consistent with surviving. And so if your fluid intake is low, so you're dehydrated, your blood volume decreases, the blood osmolarity increases. And so that is sensed by your hypothalamus, and that tells your hypothalamus to tell your posterior pituitary to release antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin, and then that causes water channels or aquaporins to transport to the collecting duct of the kidney. And so what happens is that causes excess water in your urine or water in your urine, more water in your urine, to be reabsorbed into the blood. And so that when you're hypohydrated or you're dehydrating, that causes more water to be reabsorbed from the urine. Urine volumes go down, like we saw in the previous slide, and so you absorb more water, and then that increases your blood volume, and so that sensed by the hypothalamus, and then that stops release of antidiuretic hormone, so it's a negative feedback loop. And so low fluid intake, so dehydration causes a decrease in blood volume. The posterior pituitary secretes antidiuretic hormone, and this acts in the collecting duct or the kidney to increase water reabsorption, and as a result, urine output decreases. So you reabsorb more water into the blood. And so we talked about low blood volume, so you can answer this yourself. How it is associated with hyperthermia or heat stroke. And so this is a study that was done in a laboratory, and so you can see how in the laboratory they showed that weight loss, body weight loss of as much as 5% reduces exercise capacity by 30%. And so the thing about this is that this was done in the laboratory, and since this study was done, there have been several other studies that have looked at, there's a marathon in South Africa. They've looked at Ironman ultra endurance athletes, and several of those athletes are able to are still able to perform at a very, very high level when they've lost as much as 10% body weight. That's kind of typical. And so you're expected to lose body weight when you are exercising, especially exercising in the heat. And so if you're maintaining body weight when you're exercising for long duration, exercising in the heat, so this is primarily for endurance athletes that are exercising for over an hour and a half or 2 hours, you're expected to lose body weight when you're exercising for such a long period of time in the heat. But if you're not losing body weight and you're exercising in the heat for long durations, you may be drinking too much, and so you may be at risk for hyponatremia. And so let's see, so this shows that the change in plasma volume with fluid intake versus no fluid intake. And it shows that immediately upon exercising, your plasma volume decreases because it moves into the interstitial space, and so and that's just because your blood pressure increases. And so hyponatremia occurs when plasma sodium volume falls below 135 millimoles per liter, and so exercise-associated hyponatremia. And so in the 80s, the sport beverage companies started to promote drinking while you're exercising and drinking before you're thirsty while you're exercising. And at one point, the American College of Sports Medicine, I think it was in the late 80s or early 90s, they put out a position statement and said that people should drink about 4 cups, so 8-ounce cups of water when they're exercising, and to start drinking before you're thirsty. And so people followed this, and then what started to happen is people started to develop a condition called hyponatremia. And so hyponatremia, the initial signs of hyponatremia look very much like the signs of hyperthermia. And so it's a confusion, it's a low, like a weakness, you're kind of delirious, And so oftentimes people would exhibit these symptoms, and then they would be given more fluids. And so then what would happen is, so when you're hyponatremic, your blood osmolarity falls. And so when your blood osmolarity falls, then you have more solutes intracellularly. And so what happens is your plasma or your extracellular fluid moves from the plasma into the cells. And this is especially dangerous because what happens is fluid moves into neurons, and especially cerebral neurons. And so then that can cause seizures and death. People have died of hyponatremia. And so you can see there was a football player on Blackboard. I showed you a news release about a football player. I think he had died pretty recently, and he died of hyponatremia. And so endurance athletes and athletes that are very slow and running for many hours, and they're drinking while they're excessively drinking, and they're drinking before they're thirsty, they're at greatest risk for developing hyponatremia. And so the two factors to avoid hyponatremia are to listen, so don't drink before you're thirsty, listen to your thirst mechanism, and replace sodium. And so oftentimes sport beverages have sodium, but you can also replace it with food like pretzels. And if you and so eating salty foods or replacing sodium, it causes you to be more thirsty, and so then it stimulates you to drink. And I also I was listening to an endocrine physiologist not too long ago. He's a sports endocrine physiologist, and he said that when you are hypohydrated, and he said your taste, you drink water and it tastes so good. He said because your taste receptors actually it actually does taste better when you're dehydrated. And so if you're not dehydrated or not hypohydrated, you might be less inclined to drink water. But when you're hypohydrated, your sense receptors are like, ooh, this water is really great. And so it stimulates for you to enjoy water more than normal. So these are some of the physiological responses to dehydration, especially dehydration when you exercise. But these things can happen, but essentially how you should recommend that people consume fluids while they exercise is if you're exercising for long periods, an hour and a half or over 2 hours in the heat, or exercising for long periods of time, you may need fluid replacement. But otherwise, if you're exercising for less than that, you probably don't need to consume fluids. So unless you're thirsty. Which electrolytes lost? Largest amount. Which electrolyte is lost in largest amount in sweating? Sodium. Continuous exercise lasting more than 2 hours is the point at which fluids should contain sodium and carbohydrate. So up until that point, if you're exercising at the gym, you're exercising for an hour, especially if you're exercising and the primary goal is weight loss, you don't need to consume sodium and carbohydrate in your beverage to rehydrate while you're exercising. And so water is perfectly fine to consume while you're exercising as long as it's under 2 hours. You don't need potentially sodium and carbohydrate until after that 2 hour time point. And it depends on the person. So I don't know if you can see this person right here. So he's a biking jersey on. He's probably been exercising for several hours in the heat, and you can see the salt on his jersey. Exercise-related muscle cramping used to be believed to be due to hypohydration and electrolyte loss, but now what we've realized is that heat cramps when exercising are not really related to electrolyte depletion. They're instead probably related to neural sensitivity, so that your neurons are causing your muscles to contract when you are not voluntarily trying to have them contract. And so it's probably more related to the misfiring of the neurons rather than dehydration, or rather than some electrolyte loss for most people. Let's see, and so this just shows you sweat losses with temperature and humidity, and then the changes in core temperature related to the changes in heart rate. So obviously, as you lose more sweat, your heart rate goes up, the exercise becomes more difficult. So considerable amount of water is lost during the intense exercise and the heat. But sweat is hypotonic, so you lose very small amounts of sodium and chloride in the sweat, although those are the two major electrolytes that you lose in the sweat. You also lose some potassium and some magnesium, and both, so although the plasma is the primary source of the sodium and chloride initially, you do lose fluid from both intra and extracellular compartments. And hypohydration, not dehydration, but hypohydration does impair aerobic and cognitive performance. You have to be aware of that. And the risk of heat and illness increases if you're hypohydrated and dehydrated, although you can get heat illness without being hypohydrated. So it says hydration status should be assessed and monitored. And I'm laughing because the more updated, so although your textbook is very good, there are other research, more recent research that's come out. And so I'm going to modify this section. You can measure hydration status with a radioactive, like a deuterium, and then it distributes throughout your body fluid compartments, and then you take a sample and you can measure, you can assess hydration status. You could also take a blood sample and measure plasma osmolarity, or 24-hour urine collection, but that's it's expensive, it's time consuming, and athletes, it's not available to most athletes, and it's more trouble than it's probably worth. And so, but you can do urinalysis. And so that's just looking at your urine. It's more practical, less expensive. And I would have to argue that it's not necessarily reasonably accurate, but we'll talk about it, because the sports dietitians, the SCAN, which is provides recommendations to NCAA athletes, talks about urine analysis, but as far as I know, even that site might not be quite updated, but we'll talk about it. So what you oftentimes see is a chart of urine color. And so if your urine is very dark and you're not taking vitamins, or you're not taking medications that affect your urine color, it can mean that you have a high osmolarity in your urine, so that and that might be a reflection of the fact that you're hypohydrated. But like I mentioned, if you're taking daily vitamins, or you're taking any kind of supplements, or you've been consuming sport beverages with vitamins, that changes your urine color, and that's just because you're excreting those excess vitamins in your urine, and that's causing the osmolarity of your urine to increase, so it changes the color. And so, what you can do is you can look at your urine color when you wake up in the morning, and then you pee, the first pee, look at your urine color. So if your urine is 1, 2, or 3, that's what they used to recommend, or that was the previous recommendation. Really, this is very dilute urine, so it just means that you're not excreting very much, or your osmolarity in your urine's not very high, and so it's not necessarily associated with better health. But you can look at your first morning urine. You can also think, am I thirsty? And you can also, you can weigh yourself after exercise. And so if you've lost weight after exercise, your urine is very dark and you're not taking supplements or something that would change your urine color, and you're thirsty, then there's probably a good chance that you're hypohydrated. But again, the recommendation is they're starting to, or the research is starting to recommend that urine color and weight loss are not necessarily a good way to assess hydration status. Primarily, it should be your performance and also whether you're thirsty. And if you're thirsty, then you should be drinking. So the timing, the amount of fluid, and the electrolytes that you take in should really be individualized. And so people are more or less sensitive to hypohydration and dehydration. And so, it really should depend on the type of exercise you're doing, your own sensitivity to hydration. So you develop essentially a plan, and you want to avoid as much as you can hypohydration. You want to be able to perform well. If you are exercising for over an hour and a half, you probably want to consume carbohydrates at a gram per minute. Is the maximal absorption of carbohydrates. And in a sodium sport beverage, or at a sodium concentration of about 20 to 40 milliequivalents per liter, which is about a 6 to 8% sodium solution. And so make sure it's an individualized plan. The plan should be tested under training in different environmental conditions, so you know what to expect. And the plan may be different between training and competition, because competition is a lot more stressful. And so before training, you essentially want to make sure you're adequately hydrated. If you are not fully hydrated, you can drink 1 to 2 cups in the 4 hours 1 to 2 cups of water in the 1 to 4 hours before exercise. But then you want to avoid gastrointestinal upset, and you may want to consume carbohydrate if you are trying to, for some reason, top off glycogen levels. So let's see. So, and essentially post-exercise, so I guess I thought this ended a little bit more. So post-exercise, you again want to consume about a 1 to 4 concentration of carbohydrate 4, so about 100 or 75 grams of carbohydrate, about 25 grams of protein, and you can consume that via fruit or via foods or beverages. It doesn't have to be a sports beverage, and actually it might be a meal, but it should be within the 2-hour window post-exercise. It seems like that seems to be the best time to enhance glycogen resynthesis and also to promote protein synthesis. And so we began this talk with when we talked about Rene Brunet. And so Rene Brunet was the runner, and he ran up Mount Diablo in that 50-kilometer race, so like 31 miles. It was a really hot day. And so the coroner's report came out and said that Rene Brunet, 63 years old, and that he died of heat stroke and dehydration during the Mount Diablo race. And so, like we said, it was 90 degrees. He was a 63-year-old person. Even though he was well trained and frequently ran the Mount Diablo and ran in a warm environment, so he had a good probably fluid replacement technique. Dehydration comes on quite quickly, and so the last rest stop was about 5 miles from the end, and he was found 3 miles in a ditch, 3 miles from the finish line, and he was dead in a ditch. And so one of the things, so race coordinators are starting to consider the more well-informed race coordinators are starting to think about hyponatremia. And hyponatremia is from excessive water consumption during sports activities. And so hyponatremia is becoming more frequent, and it's also more frequent when there's more frequent stops, water stops during the race. And so less frequent water stops are starting to be recommended, and water consumption when you're exercising less than 2 hours. And so there's a couple of things I want you to notice in the textbook. I'm not going to talk about them here, but you guys can ask in the class if you'd like. But notice about energy drinks. So often energy drinks contain caffeine, and they don't necessarily contain energy, and they're not recommended for kids. And so let me know if you have any questions, and I will post additional lectures about vitamins and minerals, and then we'll talk in class how we're going to finish out this semester. Anyway, have a good day. Thanks for listening.